The Quo-Cast, a Status Quo fan podcast.
This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of the Quo-Cast. And today I'm joined by Andrew L. Cope, the author of Status Quo, Mighty Innovators of 70s Rock, which has been released in the last year or so. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. And tell me, how did you find Status Quo?
Long time ago. Probably around about the end of 1972, I think, when they released Paper Plane. So, like a lot of people of my generation, shall we say, their sort of first real knowledge of Status Quo was when they released Paper Plane. Myself and a few friends used to gather around an old valve radio and listen to the pirate radio stations. You know, the sound used to sort of dip in and out, and across the airwaves came this like wonderful, refreshing new sound that turned out to be Paper Plane. And it was kind of like, well, it sounds a bit like rock and roll, but it isn't rock and roll. It sounds a bit like blues, but it isn't blues. And it had just got such an engaging appeal to it that the first thing I did was go out and buy the single, and then went out and bought the album Pile Driver. Again, in the days when you sifted through albums in the record shop, you know, there it was. It picked up the cover with, you know, the iconic cover with the heads down and air flying, and it's like, my goodness, this is who I want to be, you know. And then by March, I'd been to see them for the first time, and my life was never the same again. You know, of course, like again in those days, all the big bands, they played smaller venues. It's not like the sort of big arena gigs now. They sort of really didn't exist. So it was a lot of clubs and town hall type venues that were designed really for acoustic performances. So anywhere you sat or stood in those venues, you got a really good view. And it's, of course, it's something that suited Status Quo's particular approach, because you know, one of the things that they became famed for was the interaction that they managed to generate with their audiences. So, you know, the whole idea of them being at the front of the stage, dressed like the fans and with the heads down so that they could get closer. You felt like you were actually literally interacting with the band, because you're at the front of the stage, you could touch the feet of Rossi and Parfitt and Lancaster, you know, and a lot of the kids did. So it was an amazing visceral experience. You know, not only was the music great, but they connected with the music, and in a way that like all the bands of the time weren't doing.
Now, there was something quite unique about the both the image and performance of Quo in that period, and most fans would say since. And this book, I haven't read it yet, but I have read your synopsis, and you say they were kind of undervalued by the music press and critics and stuff at the time.
Yeah, they certainly were. One thing I did at that time was keep cuttings of all the music press reviews and articles that came out. So I've got quite a big collection of them. And yes, you know, reading back through them, there are exceptions, of course, because there were some journalists who did praise certain aspects of what they did, but the general tone right across the board was that these guys are just lame-brained idiots. They only use 3 chords, decline into a kind of a rock and roll idiom, and you know, they're making a living out of it. So, you know, it wasn't just a polite criticism. You know, it was downright poisonous denigration. You know, the language that was used by some of those journalists was shocking, to be frank. So it's kind of always been a lifetime ambition for me, you know, to sort of correct that injustice, if you like. because when you're a musician and you play the music, like when you play the guitar parts of Status Quo, you know immediately that these guys are clever. They've written clever stuff, imaginative compositions, and that goes unrecognised.
Yeah, I think it often does in the wider music press. And you say it was something of an ambition of you for you to write this book. Give us a little bit of an overview, because it seems to me to be less of a biography, perhaps, of the previous books that have been released on the band, and more of an analytical study.
Yeah, that's right. That is exactly it. I mean, there's sort of my main role as a writer, if you like, is as a musicologist. So, this is the idea of studying the music, the actual sounds, and the scales and chords that are used, and to put it on a more simple level, that sort of thing. Analysing all that, and then finding a way of presenting that in an understandable way. Because like a lot of that stuff, it's to do with music theory, and like unless you're really into that, then you're not going to really understand what's being talked about. But there are ways in which you can sort of represent it, if you like, in a more understandable format. So yeah, that's one of the sort of central themes of the book, if you like. But I am always wearing several caps, so it's quite a complex process. It's no use simply just talking about the music that they wrote and the analysis of that, because all that has a place in history. So the historical context also needs explaining, in terms of how this music, how these compositions that they've created fits into the world of rock composing at that time. In that way, then you can show how different and innovative that was. And of course, it's not just the compositional aspect of it as well. There's the performance aspect of it. The band as an ensemble, as a group of performers, were innovative as well. And then, of course, you've got Status Quo in the recording studio, which is something that's not sort of very often talked about, where they were also innovative. So they were innovative in three different fields. So in writing about that, I'm sort of wearing these different caps and then trying to pull it all together, link it all up. So some of it is analysis, some of it is talking about the music press, some of it is talking about the different recording methods that they used when they were at Pi and then when they were at Vertigo, and how that changed over time, and all that.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating read. How long did it take to kind of compile all the information together?
Well, on one level, it's a process that's gone on for many years, because even as a teenager, when I first heard Status Quo, I was already a guitarist, and the way that you learnt in those days was there were no guitar lessons. You couldn't go to a guitar teacher like you do now, learn how to play the guitar. The only way that you learned was either, from somebody else, a mate, or in most cases, for most of us who learnt at that time, it was put on a record, have a go at playing it, trial and error, keep trying and play until you actually work out what's going on in the music, and then you can play a song. And that's backed up as well by all these live performances that we could go to in these small venues that we're talking about, where if you stand at the front of the stage, you can, of course, see very clearly what the guitarists are playing. So that was something else that I did at Quo gigs as well as others. So sort of, you've heard the record, you see how they play, you come home from the gig, stand in front of the mirror, and practice what you've seen. So it's gone on for a long time, and so you learn to play these songs, you really get behind the music, you get to understand the details of all the guitar parts, and to an extent the drum parts as well, comparing it to what other bands were doing, and you can see like how different all that was. So over the course of time, like it's in a way, I've sort of always known this sort of all these nuggets of information about the band, but always wanted to sort of bring it to a book. So when I came to write the book, it was a matter of just confirming like what I thought, relearning the songs, and as well as that, then wider reading and yeah, sorry about the bell going. Somebody. Wider reading, and then just digging a little bit deeper. And then of course I also interviewed John Coughlin, I interviewed Alan Lancaster, interviewed a guy called Steve Milnick, who was in Germany, who was the band's promoter over on the continent. And then you start to get like a much bigger picture, delving more into the recording processes that they used, as like a more recent thing that I've delved into as well. So then it's a matter then of just spending the time of drawing all that together. So it probably took me about a year then to pull all that information together, to write it all up, and then send off the first draft to the publisher.
Yeah, so really looking at it in a very rounded sense, which is probably not always the case when writing this kind of thing. You mention about the first sort of half of the 70s with obviously the big albums that hit the top. Do you, like other people, where you believe perhaps that the later half of the 70s is not quite as strong?
I do. Well, I won't say it's not as strong. It was a different direction. So certainly, like the material that they wrote in the second half of the 70s was good stuff, but it was very different approach to what they wrote in the first half of the 70s. So the thing for me about the first half of the 70s is that they truly were innovators in the three areas that I talked about: performing, recording, composing. In the latter half of the 70s, much less so. They kind of established a format and style that they kind of more stuck with. Maybe to an extent, they were sort of more imitators than innovators, maybe. It's a moot point.
Yeah, it is. It depends on who you talk to and what you read. I mean, obviously, the book is called Mighty Innovators of 70s Rock. Do you go beyond the 70s in the book, or is it literally just in that decade?
Well, I cover this psychedelic period at the late 60s, and I also cover a little bit the music that came after in the 80s and the 90s, but I do it to contextualize the direction of the band, and to contextualize the innovation in the rock sense that was generated by the band in the early 70s.
Yeah, so to really get a piece of context, I mean, a lot of people would say that later on they sort of became imitators of themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's what I meant really by sort of, finding a formula, if you like. And it was a formula that was chart friendly, that was much more to do with the sort of the three chord wonder sort of idea that was tried to be pinned on the band in the early days, which simply wasn't true then. But to an extent, it was true. Once they got into, well into the 80s, then they were churning out a lot of chart hits that were sort of very much along the lines of primary chord, as we would call it, rock and roll.
Do you think that maybe the kind of chart success perhaps lessened the amount of impact creatively?
Yeah, I think personally, I think that it did, in the sense that they weren't coming up with ideas that were so new. The kind of material that they were putting out at that time, like in the 80s, it was strong material. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's stuff that wasn't particularly innovative. It's been done. It's tried and tested chord sequences, tried and tested textures and timbres, and just arranged in different ways to make good records. But like nothing really that was different.
No, pretty much treading paths in which they had done before. And obviously, as John Eden lines out in some of his amazing YouTube videos, which I'm sure you've seen, he kind of says they were recording a bit differently in the late 70s to the early stuff, which must have changed the process somewhat.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you can go back to the days of Pi, they were sort of very much, if you like, in a straitjacket there. There were rules to be followed that were basically to do with separation of sound. So like each individual player was recorded as an individual, and that sound was captured as an individual sound so that it could be transported across onto a mixing tape, and then in the mixing process prior to going onto the vinyl, all the different sounds could be EQ'd and balanced out so that one would stand out above another. And that's the way they did things. So it produced a kind of a very clean and clinical sound, recorded sound. But of course, the Quo then were very much a live act. That's what they were about. So when they moved to Vertigo, they made the decision to self-produce rather than have somebody else tell them how to do it. And they treated the studio floor like a live stage. So they weren't remotely interested in the idea of separation. So they set up, turned the amps up, and played as though they were playing a live gig. And then in that way, Rossi's amp bleeds into Parker's amp bleeds into Lancaster's amp, and drums bleed everywhere, and you get very much a live feel. And and you can hear. So like there's a breakdown in "Don't Waste My Time" on Pile Driver where Rick's just on his own, just before the final solo, churning out the old 12-bar riff, and you can hear the rest of the band. It's like a kind of pumping fists in the air, but like from the voices, they're excited. You can hear the voices on the tape, whooping and the excitement that's coming through. They're just there as though they're on stage playing to an audience. It just was not the done thing at all. Other bands recorded, like as a live performance in the studio, but they were still very much controlled in terms of separating the sound. They didn't bother. And that sound, that sort of, Pile Driver and Hello, and those albums that came at that time had that sort of live sound, live approach. They weren't generated as listening records. They were making a record of the live performances,
which is, I think, what makes them incredibly special. Do you have a particular favourite album from the period?
Well, I would say Pile Driver. I think Pile Driver is a real classic. It has some amazing moments. Big Fat Mama is, for me, an amazing piece of work. It's progressive. It's hard driving rock. It's real Quo. It's like it's got some of the 12-bar stuff. It's got progressive elements. It's uses some of the medieval modes. It's got Dick Dale type surf guitar in the middle. It's got a tremendous amount of elements that all pull together in a really, really wonderful way. It's got the recorded studio version of Roadhouse Blues, that amazing 3-part harmony singing. How many bands were doing that at the time? One or two, Uriah Heep, one or two, but you didn't expect it from a band like Status Quo. But they were adept performers, like in all respects. They brought in Park originally to support the vocals. They sort of did 3-part vocal harmonies. Twin harmony guitar that's going on in Roadhouse Blues. There's some really clever stuff where they're merging major and minor tonality stuff that ought to be discordant but isn't. They found ways around it that was sort of really incredible. So there's such a lot of stuff on Piledriver that is amazing. It's just a really classic album.
Oh, there's so much light and shade on that album. Now, Status Quo, Mighty Innovators of 70s Rock is available now, and it was the winner of the ARSC Best Historical Research in Recorded Rock and Popular Music Award 2020. How did that feel?
A bit surreal when I had the email. My first reaction was it was some kind of spam or a joke, so I had to sort of read it and reread it and go and have a look and check on the ARSC website, but there it was. And then the publisher, sort of contacted me and said, "This is brilliant, you've won this award." So yeah, elated. Certainly feel like little old me doesn't quite deserve that, but there it is. So I'll gladly accept it.
Well, congratulations. The book, would you say that this was more of an academic text, or would you say that fans would get something out of it as well?
Yeah, I sort of addressed that very issue actually in the introduction. It is like initially academic focused, so there is an academic focus in there, but it's written in such a way as to be of interest and to engage with like a wider audience, if you like. So yeah, it's definitely for the fans as well. If you've got an interest in the band, if you've got an interest in rock music, then there might be little bits in the book that might be a little bit musicological, but you can sort of you can get the gist in those passages. But there's like lots more of the book that isn't that is to do with the music press and the history and the recording process and the chronology of the band and the recordings and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it is for a wider audience, and it's one of the things, like as a high school music teacher, which I was for a long time, one of the skills that you pick up on, that you get good at, is being able to make complex topics put it across in a simple way. So I've sort of used those skills in the book to appeal to a wider audience.
Well, hopefully lots of people will pick it up after listening to this interview with yourself. I wish you all the best with the future of the book, and thank you very much for appearing on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thanks. Cheers.